going to do this talk on the development of the destroyer in 5 sections. First of all, Paul Fontenoy will describe the evolution of the destroyer from 1902 to the beginning of World War I. And then that will be followed by myself, and I will speak about the organization, location, armament and operation of destroyers during World War I. Tony Boswell will then deal with the M and R class destroyers, which were developed just before and during the war, and these together, similar vessels, were the largest class of destroyer in World War I. He will be followed by Mark Brady on the V and W destroyers, which came right at the end of the war, 1917 to 1919. Some were launched after the war, which actually became the model for destroyers for the next 20 years. And finally, I will conclude to talk about the S-class destroyers, which oddly enough came after the V&Ws, and they were a return to what I would call the light destroyer, and they were launched between 1918 and 1919. So on we go with Paul Fontenoy.
All early destroyers produced by the Royal Navy and other fleets were essentially enlarged versions of existing indigenous torpedo boat designs. The Imperial German Navy even designated its examples as Hochsee torpedo boat, high seas torpedo boats. In essence, these early destroyers were more heavily gunned versions of torpedo boats with greater displacement to accommodate the new weapons. And again, the German boats were slightly different in that they additional displacement brought slightly greater speed and seaworthiness, but experience with existing destroyers had demonstrated their two principal shortcomings: mediocre sea-keeping qualities and the inability to approach even closely their design speed under operational conditions. Reports to the Admiralty from naval attaches and observers indicated that the new German boats could maintain quite high speeds even in open waters due to their raised forecastles enhancing their potential threat to the fleet as torpedo attackers, especially as they carried a heavier torpedo armament than their British contemporaries. Consequently, the Royal Navy's river-class boats in the 1901 to 1902 to 1903 to 1904 programs marked a distinct change in design philosophy. Their priority became producing a destroyer design that could both accompany the fleet during its operations, even in poor weather conditions, and maintain a sufficient margin of speed to intercept opposing torpedo craft. To meet these goals, the river-class boats featured a small increase in dimensions with an accompanying notable increase in displacement from about 380 tons to about 450 tons, a 20% increase. All 36 boats, apart from HMS Eden, retained triple expansion machinery that developed a little less than 10% additional power. On average, it rose from about 6,600 horsepower to 7,200 horsepower. Speed on trials dropped from 30 knots to 25 knots, but the new boats could maintain 23 to 25 knots even in a seaway. Eden was powered by Parsons turbines and was about 1 knot faster than the other boats. The most significant design change was the addition of a raised forecastle instead of the turtleback of previous destroyers. In addition to providing additional accommodation, this feature conferred the much improved seakeeping the Admiralty required. These boats also were the first in the fleet to receive steam capstans. The capstans on all previous boats relied on the brute strength of the crew to operate them. Navigation and ship handling facilities were greatly enhanced with the addition of a raised chart house at the break of the forecastle. This was placed on top of a quite large galley on the main deck, itself a reflection of the requirement for spending longer uninterrupted periods at sea. This class also retained a separate conning tower sited on the main deck, but entered from the forecastle, top which was mounted the single 12-pounder gun, as on the earlier boats. In some ways, the raised forecastle was treated almost as superstructure, even though the framing was continuous to its deck. Initially, armament was unchanged from that of the previous destroyers, a single 12-pounder 5 6-pounders, and 2 18-inch torpedoes. The boats of the 1901 to 1902 program mounted all the 6-pounders on the main deck, which required sponsons for the 2 foremost weapons with cutaways along the side of the raised forecastle to allow firing ahead. The later boats dispensed with these and mounted the 6-pounders aft on the forecastle itself. In 1906, almost all the later boats replaced their 6-pounders with 2 more 12-pounders, emphasizing the primacy of the anti-torpedo boat role of the destroyers in the Royal Navy. As with previous destroyers, the final designs for these boats was left to the builders. Consequently, there were considerable variations in hull form, particularly at the stern, and more noticeably in funnel arrangements and configurations. Boats had either 2 widely spaced funnels or 4 funnels arranged in pairs. The destroyers that followed the River class represented a massive leap in size and performance, and very much reflected Jackie Fisher's obsession with speed. The 12 boats of the Tribal class, ordered under the 1905-1906 and the 2 1907-1908 programs, all received oil-fired boilers for turbine machinery 3 times as powerful as the installed power of the River class, in order to achieve a speed of 33 knots in a seaway. The intent was to reach 35 knots, but none of them ever managed this. Displacement leapt to around almost 1,100 tons for some examples of the class. Price from an average of £8,000 for the Rivers to about £135,000 for the Tribals. But the sheer size of the boats allowed for an increase in range from around 1,800 miles to almost 2,400 miles. These are sea miles, by the way, in some instances. Initially, the Tribals were undergunned. The first group of 5 boats entered service armed with 2 18-inch torpedo boats and 3 12-pounders. This was increased to 5 12-pounders in 1909. The following 7 boats received 2 4-inch guns instead of 12-pounders. During the war, it was proposed to outgun the 12-pounder boats, but a shortage of 4-inch weapons prevented implementing this proposal. Viking also was tested with a 6-inch gun instead of the 4-inch weapons, but trials at sea proved the destroyer to be overloaded with this gun, so it was removed and the original armament reinstated. Every one of the 12 destroyers in the class was different, since each builder was given a quite free hand in their designs, and even successive boats from the same builders differed from one another. Several boats had semi-turtleback forecastle arrangements, J.S. White's Mohawk and Thornycroft's Tartar. Most boats had 4 funnels, but several had only 3, and one, Viking, was possibly the only Royal Navy warship ever fitted with 6 funnels. The oddest of the Tribal class was created during World War I. During a night action near the South Foreland on the 27th of October 1916, Nubian lost its bow to a German destroyer torpedo, and Zulu's stern was blown off by a mine. The 2 destroyers were towed to Chatham, where the remaining halves were joined together to create a single destroyer, which commissioned under the name of Zubian. Fisher's influence was also very apparent in the design of the 6th destroyer of the 1905-1906 program. Swift is often currently termed a super destroyer and regularly but incorrectly considered to be a flotilla leader. It is true that Swift operated in this capacity from 1913, but the destroyer was not designed for this role. The likeliest, but still speculative role was that of a crashingly superior fast warship type to operate with Fisher's conceptual battlecruiser-based battle fleet. Swift was the largest British destroyer built, until the battle class of 1943. with more than twice the tonnage of the tribals and 50% more power, and also cost close to twice as much as the tribals at £236,000, unaffordable for repetition. Armament was 4 4-inch guns and 2 18-inch torpedo tubes. In service, Swift proved to be a very good seaboat, although rather wet forward due to the lack of flare forward in the bow. After the extravagances of the tribals and Swift, the Admiralty reverted to a more affordable design that could be built in quantity. In a notable change of policy, the basic design was produced by the Admiralty itself, and builders were given very limited leeway to make changes, the most noticeable of which was the decision as to whether to fit round or oval funnels. The 16 950-ton Beagle boats of the 1908-1909 program had turbines of around 14,500 horsepower, good for 27 knots in the seaway. Concerns about the supply of oil, which had to be imported and was in relatively short supply, led to the decision to revert to coal-fired boilers, although this decision was never to be repeated. The Beagles had a range of 2,000 miles and it was well suited for service in the North Sea. Armament was 1 4-inch gun, 3 12-pounders, and 2 21-inch torpedoes, the first use of this size in British destroyers. At the time, many commentators considered the Beagle class too slow and poorly armed compared with their German contemporaries, and this opinion continues to be repeated. In fact, the German Type 1905 boats were indeed capable of 30 knots, but were armed with either 2 88mm guns or a single 88mm and 2 or 3 52mm weapons. They also carried 3 17.7 centimeter torpedo tubes. In reality, all the German weapons were of lesser caliber than those aboard the Beagle class. The Beagle class successors formed the Acorn class of 20 boats. Ordered under the 1909-1910 program, they again were to an Admiralty design with virtually no variations. The Acorn class reverted to oil-fired boilers, and this allowed them to be somewhat smaller than their predecessors, at around 750 tons. Contract speed again was 27 knots, but most of the class exceeded this comfortably. At least 4 exceeded 29 knots. Armament was 2 4-inch guns, 2 12-pounders, and 2 21-inch torpedo tubes. Pressure continued to be applied by commentators and to some degree the operators to increase the speed of British destroyers in order to compete with the faster German boats. Slightly increased armor dimensions over the Acorn class of the 1910-1911 program enabled the 6-boat built by specialist yards, Hawthorne Leslie, Thornycroft, and Yarrow, to upgrade the machinery to produce 2,000 additional horsepower over the standard 13,500 horsepower. This resulted in these boats attaining 29 to 30 knots instead of the 27 knots of the other 16 standard boats. The entire Acheron class retained the same armament as the Acorn class, 2 4-inch guns, 2 12-pounders, and 2 21-inch torpedo boats. Yarrow also built 3 specials, Firedrake, Lurcher, and Oak. These 3 boats were very slightly larger, but had 20,000 shaft horsepower machinery. Their contract speed was 32 knots, but all exceeded this, and Lurcher surpassed 34 knots. Continued pressure for improved destroyers led the Admiralty to design an enlarged version of the Acorn class for the 1911-1912 program, the Acasta class. A 20% increase in displacement allowed installation of 24,500 shaft horsepower machinery, giving them a speed of 29 knots, and arming the class uniformly with 3 4-inch guns and 2 21-inch torpedo tubes. There were 12 standard boats and 8 further specials, whose improved performance came almost entirely from more sophisticated hull design, since other dimensions and power remained almost exactly the same. The specials all reached 30 to 32 knots, and their design played a significant part in subsequent destroyer design. In 13, the Admiralty gave class letters to all destroyers. The surviving 26 and 27 knotters became the A class, 4 funnel 30 knotters B class, 3 funnel 30 knotters the C class, and 2 funnel 30 knotters the D class. The rivers became the E class, the tribals the F class, the Beagle class became the G class, the Acorn class became the H class, and the Acheron class the I's. There was no J class because the Admiralty was working on a new design for a long-range submarine designated the J class, so the Acasta class became the K class. As a result of this decision, the boats of the 1912 to 1913 program became the L class and were given new names beginning with that letter instead of the random selection of small vessel names used for all previous destroyers. The L class was very similar in design and performance to the preceding Acasta class. All carried 3 4-inch guns, but the single torpedo tubes were replaced by twin tubes, giving the class 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. Externally, the class broke down into 2 groups, 6 built by White and Yarrow with 2 funnels, and 14 with 3 funnels from other builders. 2 additional boats were ordered at the outbreak of war, apparently because Denny still had all the lofting for boats they had yet to build. 2 boats, Leonidas from Denny and Laforet from Swan Hunter, were the first British destroyers to be fitted with geared turbines. Contemporary German high seas torpedo boats, with which the British boats were to a great extent designed to contend, were quite different. The Type 1911 boats displaced only about 800 tons. Their twin turbine machinery developed 17,000 horsepower, sufficient to drive them at 32 knots. 3 coal-fired boilers and a single oil-fired boiler generated steam for the engines, but the limited bunker capacity of about 100 tons of coal and 70 tons of oil gave the boats a range of only about 1,000 miles, less than half that of British contemporaries. Armament was also much lighter, 2 88mm guns and 4 50-centimeter torpedo tubes. One is a twin mounting and 2 single mountings. Overall, these design features clearly indicated that their principal role was torpedo attack, whereas that of the British boats, certainly up until the K class, was the interception and destruction of such attacks. Now, I do have an awful lot of documentation on what the Germans intended to do with their boats, because I have all the attack manuals which were published in these years, but I do not have the same information from the British. So I'm basing this to some extent on the way that the British designed their ships rather than on a detailed analysis of their tactical use. Although I will point out that a lot of the non-official documentation, books published by various people during this period, all feed into the idea that destroyers were intended to attack torpedo attackers primarily.
There will be some of you listening in who will know much more about parts of this topic than I do. For as some of you know, my expertise is in a decidedly different area. However, I felt that it would be helpful to step back for a moment from concentrating on design and look at how destroyers were organized, equipped for operations during the Great War. In the run-up to the war, there had been debate about the role of the destroyer within the fleet. One would immediately think of reconnaissance, but that role was undertaken by light cruisers or scout cruisers. The destroyer was seen as integral to the fleet in a defensive role as a means of destroying incoming enemy destroyers and torpedo boats, or in the offensive role of torpedoing the enemy's main units. Now, discussion shifted to and fro between which was the priority role, with the latter, that of the offensive torpedo action, taking pole position at the outbreak of war. The view was that light cruisers were best classed to engage enemy destroyers' roles, not least because destroyer squadrons and divisions could be used independently in action against on an enemy coast to engage destroyers as they emerged from harbours and ports. So for most of the war, the destroyer gun complement was uprated to a minimum of 3 by 4 inch quick-firing Mark IVs. And where single torpedo tubes were fitted, these were replaced by twin sets. As you heard Paul saying that the L class brought in the twin torpedo tube sets. In 1914, destroyers carried no other armament, except possibly the charge sweep used as a cumbersome method of catching U-boats, but more of that later. Now, as a slight digression, the Royal Navy started the war with just over 200 destroyers, but over half of these will be classes A to D. And we know these were torpedo boat destroyers. By the end of the war, the Navy had 407 destroyers, 407, of which 94 were TBDs. These destroyers were organized into flotillas, in which, in an ideal world, there would be a flotilla leader in the form of a light cruiser. And that flotilla would be divided into 2 squadrons, again, with a scout cruiser as a leader. The divisions, or the squadron was divided into 3 divisions, and each division into 2 subdivisions of 2 destroyers each. I have to say that I do not see the reason for having subdivisions. This total amounts to 24 destroyers and 3 light or scout cruisers in a flotilla. So this leads me to the subject of destroyer leaders. The problem in using light cruisers as leaders was that they were not fast enough. So as the war went on, they were replaced with specifically designed leaders, which were as fast as the destroyers and twice their displacement. And some of these were destroyers destined for other navies, but hurriedly requisitioned by the Royal Navy at the outbreak of war. This table shows the classes and numbers in each class of destroyer leaders. And we'll see by the end of the war, we had 40 such vessels. Generally, they had far greater firepower than their squadrons and divisions, and this may be connected to the Admiralty's overestimation of the armament of the German destroyers. In fact, all British destroyers were well armed to take on their German equivalents. All leaders had the necessary signalling and WT equipment and complement to fit them for their roles. This meant more accommodation and quite a lot of antenna between the fore and mainmasts. Until the large V&W destroyers started appearing in 1917-18, they generally presented 4 funnels, but were not alone in having this arrangement. At the outset of the war, they were located as follows. Now, the Grand Fleet was based in Scapa Flow and at Rosyth, and they had 2 fairly recent classes of destroyer, the H and the K class. At Harwich, they had even more modern destroyers, the I and L classes. Now, the thing about Harwich was that it actually was the front line of the Navy against the Germans. So they were out a lot towards the edge of the German Bight on reconnaissance and various patrols. So they had some very good destroyers for their time. Now, at Dover, they had the 6th Flotilla, which was largely the F class or tribal class, plus quite a lot of TBDs. Then there were local patrol flotillas, which were probably mainly TBDs, Humber with the 7th, Forth with the 8th, Tyne with the 9th. And in the Mediterranean, there was a 5th flotilla, which was mainly of rivers, which were replaced by modern destroyers later on. Now, the number of flotillas grew during the war, and at its conclusion, the Grand Fleet had 6 flotillas, plus another under command for operations. Flotillas were moved about, And for example, the 9th on the Tyne was moved to Harwich, which supported Dover as and when necessary. Indeed, shortly before the war started, the 5th flotilla was moved from Harwich to the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was of secondary importance to the Royal Navy in World War I, but was a priority for the French. Had the Dardanelles operation been successful, that might have changed. The TBDs, classes A to D, incapable of steaming with the Grand Fleet in any type of a seaway, or the Harwich cruiser destroyer force, even in a moderate sea, would be located at the local patrol areas, including what was to become the Dover Patrol. I mentioned that destroyers were equipped solely with 4-inch or 12-pounder guns plus torpedo tubes, but that was about to change. The naval war of 1914-18 can be split into two reasonably distinct parts, before and after Jutland. After Jutland, the probability of another major fleet action seemed increasingly unlikely, and other forms of naval aggression suggested themselves. The Germans were to switch to unrestricted U-boat warfare, having seen the possibility of a high seas fleet establishing a blockade of Britain fail. They strove to do the same by using their U-boat forces and declaring this unrestricted form of submarine warfare. Now, the submarine threat had been considered by the Admiralty before the war, but to counter it in terms of armament, it would be the towed sweep with a charge attached. Now, two forms were tried. First, a grapnel hanging from an underwater kite, or possibly a float, and towed by a steel cable, at the top of which was suspended a torpedo. And when the cable went tight, the torpedo was released. The cable went tight because it hit the submarine, and it slid down the wire to collide with the submarine and blow it up. A second system involved towing a flattened vertical loop with the top of the loop attached to floats, and the bottom of the loop had a whole series of charges on it, had a kite at the front end towed from the stern of the vessel. Dragging this device over where a submarine was thought to be could result in contact against the submarine's hull. Firing could be electrical. Now, neither of these systems were popular, not least because a slow speed was required for their deployment. But just imagine having to try and cope with all this gear in a seaway. However, a high-speed sweep was developed whereby a destroyer was able to attack a submarine at up to 25 knots by streaming an explosive paravane. But by 1916, with the help from HMS Vernon, the torpedo school, a method of setting off a dropped charge underwater had been devised and subsequently improved with this device. That allowed the charge to be detonated at a chosen depth, intervals being at 50 feet. Now, you will find no evidence of depth charge gear on any destroyer before 1916, and even then, it was rudimentary. Destroyers were allowed to carry 4 depth charges, mine layers only 1. By the end of the war, this had increased substantially, and depth charge chutes carrying 6 or so charges can be seen at the sterns of the larger destroyers. Not surprising, really, in view of the increased U-boat threat to shipping. By 1917, Thornycroft had been able to design and build a depth charge thrower, which allowed destroyers at the end of the war to throw and drop a pattern over the suspected location of the submarine. This increase in anti-submarine equipment and firepower coincided with a new coastal convoy task allotted to destroyers, for which 75 were needed. Unfortunately, only 43 were available, but other escort vessels were available in the form of sloops and P-class patrol boats. The greatest U-boat threat was perceived as being around the British Isles and the adjacent continent. On the other hand, oceanic convoys were escorted by obsolete cruisers, armed merchant cruisers, and pre-dreadnought battleships. As it did not arrive until the end of the war, and hydrophones really needed vessels to be fairly static in order to detect a submarine, So the technique would be for it to spot a U-boat on the surface and, if possible, ram it, or if it had managed to crash dive, to run over its position and fire or launch your depth charges and hope for a result. This is a painting by William Wiley, absolutely beautiful painting of an L-class destroyer about to destroy a submarine in the southern North Sea. By 1916, the possibility of air attack had started and was becoming more frequent. This would particularly apply to those destroyers operating close to the enemy coastline, where land-based planes could reach out over the sea. The first anti-aircraft was the British 1.5-pounder pom-pom, usually in single-barrel form. Its location was normally on a bandstand on the main deck, though towards the end of the war, in the larger destroyers, these weapons, in their 2-pounder form, could be found on the wings of a bridge. Now, I reckon this is a World War II photograph, but it may well be on one of the W or V class destroyers, which were used as escorts across the Atlantic in World War II. The other weapon that was available was a 3-inch high-angle gun. That was used in World War I. Again on the bandstand, on the main deck. In some cases, it would have replaced on a destroyer the center 4-inch quick-firing Mark IV. Now, anyone wishing to build a model of any of these World War I destroyers must realize that retrofitting of equipment and armament was going on the whole time, and that modifications kept occurring to keep up with the developing threats. This applied to anti-submarine gear as much as anti-aircraft gear. So once a choice of subject is made by the model maker, then so must a date on which it is to be portrayed. Now, most people do not associate mine lay with destroyers. Whilst in the years preceding the war, the Royal Navy had converted some old Apollo-class cruisers from the late 1800s to operate as mine layers, and had a stock of Italian Elia mines, the Admiralty saw no need for laying offensive minefields. Indeed, the view was that minefields would constrict the ability of the Royal Navy's battle squadrons to close with and destroy the enemy. This despite the fact that we had lost the battleship HMS Audacious in October 1914 in the Irish Sea to a mine laid by the Germans. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty at the outbreak of war, was firmly against mine laying, except for the protection of Britain's harbours and ports. Unlike the British Admiralty, the Germans had the best stocks of mines and the best technology at the outbreak of war. British stocks amounted to 4,000 of these Italian-designed spherical mines, which were becoming obsolete. In fact, the poor quality of the mines may have contributed to the general reluctance to use them. Nevertheless, to their great credit, some of these old converted cruisers did manage to lay offensive minefields in January 1915 without any casualty to themselves. They were then retired. And interesting to note here, going back to the picture of the mines on the view of the stern of one of these vessels, what they obviously did was razzied her stern quarterdeck down to the level of the main deck and put in the mines and their tracks there below of the ejection over the side. The BE, British Elia mine, as it was known, was found to be unstable in handling, a fact which was exposed when one merchant vessel, modified for mine laying, blew up in a huge explosion whilst her crew were preparing their mines. This put a stop to all talk of offensive mine laying until later in the year. Two things changed this state of affairs. Jellicoe, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, began to take the view that mining the exits from the German North Sea ports could assist him in knowing when the high seas fleet was likely to appear, since it would be preceded by mine-sweeping activity. He reinforced this opinion later in the year, in August. Also, by late 1915, Winston Churchill was otherwise busy with the Dardanelles campaign, which was not going at all well. However, in 1915, discussion had been continuing as to what vessel would be used, but best vessel would be used for mine laying offensive minefields in the Heligoland Bight, under the noses of the Germans. What was wanted was a fast vessel with a low silhouette and a shallow draft. but capable of carrying at least 60 mines, i.e. a destroyer. So in September, HMS Abdeel had been a destroyer leader, was converted for mine laying. This involved laying tracks along the sides of her main deck to take the mines and their mooring boxes. And you can see the tracks just here. She's probably got about 30 mines each side there. Very fine complement of mines. She was a long ship. These tracks had to end in a chute over the quarterdeck. Now here is a model in build which shows the tracks here. You can see the double tracks there, and you can see the chute that has to go over the two quarters. Notice the depth charge throwers, which I talked about here. To the observant, this chute was a very distinctive indicator of the purpose of the ship, as was the moving of the ship's boats forward from their customary place just after the break in the forecastle to make way for more mines. Other equipment was necessary, such as a winch to haul the mines down the trackway and a device for measuring the distance between mines as they paid out. The loading of mines severely affected the stability of the ships. So to compensate, the aft gun was removed and one or both sets of torpedo tubes, which we here and off screen, will also take them off. What is most surprising is that the crews of the destroyers so converted could carry out the conversion themselves in the space of 24 hours with minimal dockyard support. However, this did not involve relaying the trackway, as once fitted, it would have remained. Another task was to install the rackwork to hold the mines in place as they were dragged down the trackway. Whilst outboard of the mines, canvas screens were rigged to the stanchions and guardrails to obscure the sight of the mines, and on them were painted the torpedo tubes and the gun. It was hoped that when viewed from a periscope, it would appear that this destroyer was still in her original role, not in her minesweeping role. Not surprisingly, the destroyers chosen for this role were usually destroyer leaders, because they were far larger than normal destroyers, in fact almost double their displacement, and could therefore take a greater payload. Abdeel was used to lay a minefield across the path of the retreating high seas fleet as they steamed home after the engagement at Jutland. This resulted in severe damage to the Ostfriesland. From mid-1916 onwards, an increasing number of destroyers were dual-role into this work, and in January 1918, this resulted in the formation of the 20th Mine-Laying Destroyer Flotilla. The fact that these destroyers managed to lay so many extensive fields in the enemy's backyard with only two disasters, a collision and a mine strike, is a testament to the navigation, seamanship, and discipline displayed by all their crews. It is not surprising, in view of all this, that the destroyer came to be known as the maid of all work, and will perhaps always remain popular as a subject for the ship model.
The model photos shown are from Jim Bowman's excellent model of HMS Mary Rose, made to 1/350th scale. Mary Rose was an Admiralty M-class and part of the first emergency war programme, and was built by Swan Hunter Shipyard in 1915. In the run-up to the 1913 naval estimates, the Admiralty expressed fears that the new German warships were faster than Britain's by several knots. Intelligence had provided a specification that gave a top speed of the latest destroyers, gun and torpedo boats as 36 knots. It was obvious that air destroyers, who already had trouble keeping up with their own fleet, would not be able to compete with those of Germany. At a conference of naval staff in June 1912, Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, was deeply concerned with this situation, and after the conference wrote to the Director of Naval Construction, ending his letter with the phrase, "Nothing less than 36 knots will be satisfactory." As the L-class were considered too slow for future operations, the Director of Naval Constructions asked 4 shipyards to produce designs based on the hull from HMS Firedrake, but with an increased 275-foot length, totally oil-fired and capable of 35 knots with 150 tons of fuel on board. These became the M-class variants. Those from the Hawthorne-Leslie shipyard, who built 2 ships, had 4 funnels, each exhausting a single boiler and driving 3 shafts. Interestingly, these were the last destroyers built with 4 funnels, except for some flotilla leaders. Thornycrafts, who built 6 ships, had 3 funnels from 3 boilers and had twin shafts. Finally, Yarrow shipbuilders, who built 10 ships, had 2 funnels from 3 boilers with twin shafts. All the variants met the original brief, but were only fitted with 1 Vickers 2-pounder autocannon or pom-pom, instead of the 2 which were fitted to the Admiralty design. The White Company declined to design a ship as they were in the throes of a takeover bid. Shortly after asking for designs, the Director of Naval Construction asked the Admiralty designers to produce a standard design of 265 feet long, 26 feet 8 inches beam, displacement of around 900 tons, with 24,500 shaft horsepower and a speed of 33.5 knots, but not based on Firedrake. This became the Admiralty M-class destroyer, of which 85 were built by 14 different shipyards, and together with the R-class, of which 62 were built, became the most abundant destroyers during the war. All the ships had a similar as-built armament fit of 3 single 4-inch quick-firing guns, 2 Vickers 2-pounder autocannon or pom-poms, and 2 twin 21-inch torpedo tubes on swivel mountings. However, as Ian said, depending on the availability at the time of the build and armaments retrofitted as either experimental or for a particular operation, the combination of armaments differed on individual ships. All the designs needed bigger boilers than the R-class and were all oil-fired. The first 6 ships built had 3 boiler rooms with twin turbines, retained the geared cruising turbines. All the ships built under the 5 emergency war programs did not have cruising turbines, but had 3 direct drive turbines onto 3 shafts. The extra space created by this arrangement allowed the dynamos to be moved from the accommodation into the engine room. This gave room to install more and improved accommodation facilities. They still all only achieved 34 knots. The number of names required for the ships far exceeded the usual practice of using the class letter in the name. The M-class spanned M, O and P, and the R-class spanned R and into S. None of the designs met the original request from Winston Churchill, although they were still 2 knots faster than the Owls. Considering their later discovered shortcomings of very poor seaworthiness, at anything over force 3 or 4 blow, the forward turret had to be evacuated because of water shipping over the forecastle. And there are numerous reported incidents of equipment being carried away from the forecastle. Personally, I suspect that had not war broken out, the class would have been short-lived. The last 8 of the 4th emergency war programme and all but 2 of the 5th war programme became known as the M-class repeats and were modified to have a rake stem with increased flare on the bows to improve seakeeping. The final 2 of the programme had a hull redesign to incorporate a wider beam, the adoption of an even greater rake stem, and increased flare on the bows. These 2 became the prototypes of the R-class. With the redesign of the hull, it was decided to in view of the more efficient machinery to incorporate more upgrades into ships and a redesignation to R-class. These included adopting the hull form of the M repeats with their rake stem and, in addition, increased the hull length to 275 feet and raised the forecastle by an additional foot. The direct drive turbines were replaced by two geared turbines onto two shafts with no cruising turbines. This gave an increase in speed to 36 knots with a reduced fuel consumption. The armament was changed to 3 4-inch quick-firing guns, 2 Vickers 2-pounder pom-poms, and 2 twin 21-inch torpedo tubes on swivel mounts. And again, as with the M-class, this would change as circumstances dictated. 62 ships of the class were built between 1916 and 1917. These two classes became the main workhorses for the Royal Navy for the rest of the war.
David Brown, D.K. Brown, sometime deputy head of the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors, the RCNC, and author of several books and articles on the design and performance of British warships, wrote in his centenary history of the Corps that in the mid-1920s, the V&Ws were considered close to ideal as fleet destroyers for the Royal Navy. Hence, the interwar A to I classes were essentially somewhat larger versions, and the 1939 through 45 war emergency programs, destroyers of the O&P through CA to CR classes, retained the same armament arrangement but with improved weapons. Yet although the RCNC had every reason to be proud of what was definitely an Admiralty design, David Brown said nothing in his 1983 history of their design process. And in his later work on warship design in the era of the Great War, only made the brief remark that the V&Ws would almost accidentally be one of the greatest warship designs of all time. There was in truth nothing accidental about their success. The DNC staff responsible had experience of designing destroyers, and the orders were placed with established destroyer builders. Furthermore, as their general arrangement drawings show, the V and the R classes may have differed considerably in external appearance, yet they were essentially similar. Indeed, their layouts below the upper deck, between the forward bulkhead of the forward oil fuel tank, that's line A through A on the diagram, and the after bulkhead of the engine room, line B through B, the layouts were virtually identical, and both classes had the same propulsion machinery. But the V class were lengthened some 20 foot forward and 16 foot aft, and their beam was increased almost 3 feet to preserve hull proportions and allow increased top weight. The crucial additions in that latter respect being the structures upon which B and X guns were mounted, and the command bridge with a compass binnacle, signalling equipment, rangefinder, etc., above the wheelhouse. Much of their success was due to the V&Ws being the first Admiralty fleet destroyers designed with the benefit of extensive wartime experience. But their story began with a requirement for destroyer leaders. As the numerous M-class ordered prior to mid-1915 entered service, there would be a requirement for more leaders. And during the winter of 1915 through 16, the DNC was asked to design a leader capable of 34 knots with the same propulsion machinery as the R-class destroyers. The 2-knot reduction in trial speed was considered of no consequence, as it was common knowledge in the service that destroyers never achieved their maximum speed in operational conditions. And this design would be the 300-foot leader, so-called, intermediate in hull size between the M and R classes and the Lightfoot class Admiralty M leaders, but as fast as the latter and with the same armament. The implications of what could be achieved by modifying an existing design were the changes made during construction, 1915 through 1916, of HM ships Grenville and Parker, the 8th and 9th units of the Admiralty M leaders. Without altering hull dimensions, the bridge was made higher and moved slightly aft, while ahead of it, a deck house was constructed on the forecastle as the base for a super-firing 4-inch QF gun, doubling the firepower on forward bearings. The final unit of the Parker class was further modified with a raked bow, increased bow flare, and increased freeboard. That's HMS AS Anzac, all of which would be features of the V&Ws. The experience of successfully redesigning the improved Lightfoots while they were building gave the DNC constructors confidence to design the 300-foot leader, of which 5, including HMS Valhalla, were ordered in April 1916. With super-firing guns forward and aft and retaining the R-class machinery in a somewhat enlarged R-class hull, it proved possible to build a leader which was as good in all significant respects as the Parkers, but less expensive to build and operate. Meanwhile, since the early days of the Great War, officers of the Grand Fleet, from destroyer captains up to the CNC, had recommended that significantly larger fleet destroyers were required, not just to carry increased armament, but with greater fuel capacity, hence greater endurance, a higher bridge set further back from the bow, and generally more seaworthy. Admiral Jellicoe personally emphasised that increasing hull size would confer better seakeeping qualities, a consideration all too frequently absent in discussion of British destroyer design, which then begged the question, why design and build the new leaders and larger torpedo boat destroyers when one design would meet both requirements? Hence the order in July 1916, soon after the battle off Jutland, for 25 of the Admiralty V class, which in all significant respects were repeats of the 300-foot leaders. And they were followed in December 1916 by an order for 21 identical Admiralty W class. Together with the Admiralty Mod Ws, which were armed with 4.7-inch guns, and the Thornycroft Specials, a total of 68 B&Ws were completed between 1917 and 1924. Moving on to a model. This model is of HMS Vanity as completed in June 1918, by which time most British destroyers carried, in addition to their traditional torpedoes and low-angle guns, formidable anti-submarine armament. Vanity has 2 depth charge rails and 2 Thornycroft depth charge throwers, as will be shown on the next slide. There are the depth charge rails aft and spare depth charges. And here you have the 2 Thornycroft depth charge throwers, again with spare depth charges, meaning that the ship would drop a pattern of 5 rather than dropping individual depth charges or a line. And this was found to be the most efficient way of taking care of U-boats. The next slide shows the torpedo tubes. A Jutland lesson was that our destroyers needed to carry more torpedoes, hence the new triple torpedo tubes, by the simple expedient of mounting an extra tube on top of the existing double mount. The next slide shows the funnels and the 3-inch high-angle gun, while the next illustrates very well the protection that the blast shield, which protected A gun from the blast of B gun, the protection that also provided to the wheelhouse and bridge from heavy seas coming over the bow. This is to say, it's not only a blast screen, but is in effect almost a second forecastle. And here we have a vertical view or an overhead view of the B gun and the bridge itself. It's just as well that the bridge was protected from water coming over the bows. because as you can see, the compass platform was not exactly a comfort zone. And here I'll conclude. The V&Ws proved formidable both as surface attack units and in defense against ships and submarines. They were arguably the best warship design of the era of the Great War. And they set the benchmark for development of fleet destroyers for over 20 years. None of the V&Ws survives today, but as long as we have high quality models, seafarers and anyone else who cares to can still appreciate the sterling qualities of the ships themselves. Thank you.
It might interest people to know that the majority destroyer in 20 mine-laying flotilla was the V-class destroyer. They made excellent mine layers. They'd got the length on the main deck, they'd got the speed and the carrying capacity. So yeah, a lot went to mine layers. You may wonder why I'm dealing with S-class destroyers after Mark has spoken on V and W-class destroyers. The reason is partly to do with the false assumption by British naval intelligence that the German destroyer development had produced a more powerful model with superior size and armament to British destroyers. This prompted the building of the V-class, one of the reasons for the V-class. This alarm proved not to be the case, and the scare was over by early 1917. Decision was then made to order a smaller class to replace the war losses and the exhaustion of the pre-war batches, and to meet the Grand Fleet's demand for 100 destroyers. In all, 67 destroyers of this class were built and commissioned in between April 1917 and April 1920. Now that is HMS Walker, and this is an R-class boat. The S-class destroyers were the direct descendants of the R-class, or improved M-class. Like the M-class, they had a short forecastle and 3 funnels, the R-class did. However, by adjusting the boiler arrangements, it became possible to cover the first 2 boilers with 1 funnel, allowing the bridge to be brought aft and therefore the forward gun. Now that is the old R-class. The S-class were very similar, but here, this is the Thornycroft version of an S-class boat. But very similar to the improved R-class, and it was difficult for the DNC to, when decisions were being made about the next build program, to describe the difference. Return to the 4-inch gun and twin as opposed to triple torpedo tubes. As you've heard, the VWs could have had 4.7 guns, were changes that helped to keep these vessels light and fast. These light ships came to be regarded by Captain F of the Grand Fleet in 1918 as the best seakeeping destroyers in the Navy at this time. Although it has to be said that the larger V and W class destroyers, and of course the 8 Shakespeare class leaders, had a very long foredeck with a slight turtleback cross section, an improved shear line, and with reasonable flare to their forward sections. And this have made quite a difference to their ability to avoid drowning the forward gun and bridge as they ploughed into a head sea. They came in at a mean average of 1,000 tons, carried 3 4-inch quick-firing Mark IVs and 2 sets of twin torpedo tubes and a double 2-pounder pom-pom. They could not take much weight on their stern, as it tended to dig in when they were at speed. So they were not given anti-submarine swept charge with its frightful paravane paraphernalia. And they were good, these boats, for 36 knots. Post-World War I, some were converted to mine laying. And you can see here this shadow on the quarter, which is underneath the chute where the tracks will come down and push the mines over the end of the vessel. You can also see 2 other things here, the good, quite a marked flare at the bow, and how small it is. Some also acted as escorts, and we heard about the escorts in the First World War, and they were certainly used for coastal and Atlantic escorts in the Second World War. In fact, one of them, Sabre, made more trips to and from Dunkirk than any other ship during the evacuation of our expeditionary force in 1940. Now, one of the reasons I'm attracted to these little ships is that the first book I was given on model ships, I must have been 12, so we're talking about 1952. I must have been 12 or so, contained the plans for one of these destroyers. And I always thought they were the best looking destroyers we ever produced. You will not find a model of them anywhere, but I tried to make one when I was at school, and I tried to carve it out of a solid block of pine wood. I got it all done, and then slowly the whole hull twisted on me. So that had to be binned, a pity. You will not find a model of them anywhere, but there are plenty of editions of the V and W class, and even some of the R class. Now, to conclude, the next session will start with the lessons learned from the Royal Navy's experiences of destroyers in World War I, and will also deal with what other navies were doing during that conflict, principally those of Germany and the United States of America. I thought I'd leave you with this lovely peaceful scene of Harwich at Daybreak by William Wiley, with a view of an early destroyer, and beyond, some light cruisers in the middle distance, and overhead, a seaplane.